role, both now and in the longer term. But of course, there can be a political cost also in dealings with the community. Individuals don't always want to have their wishes denied. In some instances, according to the published literature, individuals are actually forced out of the region because of their leadership role, because their positions, which might be genuinely leadership roles, also prove to be unpopular. And leadership isn't necessarily about popularity. And of course, in some regions and some communities, leaders may be shown by the community because they seek to bring about change. Even though it's the right change, it may be unpopular. So leadership comes at a cost. But we also need to acknowledge where leadership traditionally resides in Australia. Across Australia, there have been a number of studies that have looked at leadership structures in rural and regional Australia. And what they find is that community leaders tend to be older, better educated, have higher incomes, are male, and are disproportionately drawn from the land-based elite. Well, many of you are probably sitting there thinking, tell me something new. I've just painted a picture of every cocky, every squattocracy that we've ever thought of or ever dreamed of. But it's important to realise why this is the case. Firstly, farmers almost by definition have slack time. When they're not busy harvesting, when they're not busy dealing with their livestock, they actually have significant periods of time when they're not particularly overemployed. That's point number one. They effectively have periods of slack time, which gives them slack resources which they can then deploy to their community. And secondly, and most importantly, of course, they also have a strong grounding in their communities and strong social networks, which both give them a motivation to become leaders and also the social networks to bring about change. There's also a strong culture in many of these communities around the land-based farmers providing leadership, and the cultural element of leadership shouldn't be ignored. But the thing we need to recognise, of course, is that Australia is changing, and with it, our leadership is changing. Our economy is becoming more diverse and service-oriented, and so conventional leaders may no longer be representative of the new economy in those regions, which perhaps calls for a new set of leaders. We're all aware there are challenges to family farms, and that means there are certainly fewer farmers on the ground to take up leadership roles, but also those who are now running and managing the land may not be owners and may not have the capacity or the remit from their employers to actually become leaders within their community, which is a loss for that community through the loss of leadership positions. The rise of mining and mining-related employment may also challenge existing leadership because, amongst other things, corporate entities often are headquartered outside of the region and feel uncomfortable or are not welcome to take a leadership role in that region. Sea change and tree change communities represent a different constituency with different dynamics and different needs, and they themselves struggle to generate leadership and at the same time are no longer represented by existing leadership. And finally, we need to recognise that many existing industries and some communities are being hollowed out by the process of economic and demographic change. So it means that in some instances we have leaders leaving the region and we have a loss of new type of leaders coming into the region who are no longer able to express their potential for leadership because they're not connected into existing power structures. It's important also to recognise that Australia runs a lean economy. Since the 1980s, Australians have, on average, worked the second longest hours in the OECD. We have a small corporate sector, we have a small public sector, we do not have a large bureaucracy, and that strips away, particularly from non-metropolitan regions, the capacity for slack resources and, by definition, the capacity for leadership to respond adequately when there are significant challenges in that place. We also need to recognise that the target and audit culture of government allows little room for slack resources or non-core business in most public sector entities. Read an Auditor General's report. It's not fun, but it's good for your soul. An Auditor General's report tells you this program received money for this task, they spent it on this fund, and they spent it on this purpose. It either receives a positive review or a negative review. There is little capacity for a broader role. There is little funding for a broader engagement with the region and its requirements. This is often referred to as the silo mentality within government, and it doesn't serve regions and their leaders well. And I guess the other point to make is that there's an absence of clear articulated pathways for the emergence of leaders locally or regionally. Australian federalism is unusual in some respects when compared to other federations and other federal systems of government. We have a relatively weak local government sector when compared to both the state governments and also when compared to the federal government. That means there's real challenges for local governments to produce leaders, as few people are attracted into what is often seen to be a highly localised set of decision-making processes. So what then do we see as the implications? I think we need to build the institutions of leadership regionally, which means that we need to recognise leadership as a goal and as a priority of regions and regional policy. We don't currently make the development of leadership a priority goal within our government sector processes or within the private sector. One of the things that's critical, of course, is that in many large institutions, the development of the next generation and generations of leadership is given priority, but we don't do that at a regional scale. We need to create pathways for leadership, and that includes training or coaching for leaders as they develop in their roles over time and as they move through their life course and take on a number of different challenges. I think we also need to accept the leadership role of government agencies and their staff. In lean regions and in lean economies, we have to recognise that it's often the public sector agencies who are going to be most effective in delivering leaders into the future and into that community. In the 1990s in particular, many banks and many accountancy firms withdrew from regional communities, and as they withdrew, there was a loss of the bank managers, there was a loss of the accountants, who then in turn resulted in a loss of capacity in many community groups within that environment. And finally, I'll conclude by saying that one of the other things we need to do is celebrate and reward leadership and its achievements. Leaders are important. We may not always agree with our regional leaders, but we must recognise their contribution and reward them appropriately. Thank you.